The late sun hung low over the desert town of Willow Run, casting everything in a faded gold that made the dust shimmer like ash from an old fire. The kind of fire that had long since burned out, but still left behind heat in the bones. It was the kind of afternoon where time itself seemed to slow down, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful exactly, just empty. You could hear the creak of a porch board from a block away. Even the dogs didn't bark, just lay sprawled in the shade, too tired to care. The heat clung to the skin like a second shirt, and the air, it didn't move, not unless the wind decided to sigh through, and even that felt half-hearted. Sheriff Mason Dyer sat on the steps outside his office, one boot planted on the porch rail, the other flat on the boards beneath him. 46 years old, 9 of them spent in this town, and he carried every one of them like the dust on his coat, quiet, worn in, and settled. Before Willow Run, he'd been a soldier, 10 years of that, maybe more, long enough to forget why he signed up, long enough to remember every name he couldn't save. He came west because he wanted silence. Not just quiet, but that deep, aching kind of stillness only the desert can give you. And Willow Run? Well, it was too dry for gold hunters, too far for lawbreakers, and just out of the way enough for a man to disappear into it. And that was just fine by Mason. He wasn't a man of many words, didn't need to be. Folks in town had learned that early on. When Mason Dyer stood up, people sat down. Not out of fear, but out of something close to respect, maybe even trust. You couldn't quite call him warm, but he wasn't cold either. He just was, a fixture, like the mountains in the distance or the cracked boards underfoot. And then she came. You ever seen something so out of place that it stops you in your tracks, not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it doesn't belong to the picture you've gotten used to? That's how it was. Mason spotted her from the far end of the street, walking straight through the heat haze like a ghost out of the Badlands. No horse, no shoes, just a woman and a child, walking like they'd been doing it for days, maybe longer. She wasn't much older than 25, but life had already taken a few pieces out of her. Her dress was torn, stained with dust and sun, and something darker near the hem. One of the straps hung off her shoulder, and her feet were red with dried blood. She didn't limp, though. She didn't look around for help. She just walked forward, carrying that boy, no more than 3 years old, probably less, wrapped around her like he was the last part of her she had left to protect. The kid didn't cry. He just clung to her, half asleep, arms around her neck like he was afraid to let go. And maybe he was. Mason didn't move at first, just watched. He'd seen desperation before, seen men drag themselves out of worse. But this wasn't desperation. This was survival, stripped bare of shame. A woman like that, walking into town, eyes empty, skin burnt, hands trembling, but still standing, that's not someone asking for help. That's someone who's already given up everything and is still walking. She reached the foot of the steps and stopped. Her eyes met Mason's, red, swollen, unfocused, but steady. And in a voice that was cracked and dry, she said, "Take me as your concubine. I can do whatever you want. Just feed my boy." No drama, no begging, just words. Flat, heavy, and real. It hit him like a punch to the ribs. She wasn't bluffing, wasn't trying to manipulate or play on sympathy. There wasn't even shame in her voice, just exhaustion. that kind of soul-deep weariness that takes up residence behind your eyes and never quite leaves. Mason stood, stepped aside, and opened the door to his office. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. She paused for half a second, maybe wondering if this was a trap, but then she walked inside. You know, sometimes people talk about kindness like it's supposed to come with a speech or a smile, but real kindness, the kind that matters, it's quiet. It's in the way a man opens a door without asking questions. It's in the way someone notices when you've got nothing left and gives you something without making you earn it. That was Mason. Inside, the air was cooler, not by much, but enough to breathe again. The space was plain: desk, 2 chairs, a cot in the back, maps rolled up with twine, a rifle on the wall. Mason didn't ask who she was. He didn't demand an explanation. He just grabbed a hunk of cornbread and poured a glass of milk, still cool from the jug, and set them on the desk. She didn't eat. Not yet. She set the boy down on her lap and whispered something in his ear. The kid blinked, reached with shaking hands for the bread, and started eating slow, careful, like he thought it might vanish if he moved too fast. And Mason watched. Not with pity, not with judgment, just with the quiet awareness of someone who had once been hungry for something they couldn't name. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe not hunger for food, but for safety, for rest, for a place where no one's waiting to take something from you. She had that look, and Mason saw it. After the boy finished, Mason handed her a blanket and pointed toward the back room. Still no words, still no questions, and she nodded, just once, and carried her son toward the cot. He watched her go, watched the faint blood marks her feet left on the floorboards, and then he returned to his porch, picked up his jerky, and sat down like it was just another evening in Willow Run. But it wasn't. Something had shifted. A woman and her son were sleeping inside his office, maybe just for a night, maybe longer. He didn't know yet. What he did know was this: she didn't belong to anyone, and no one was going to take her out of that town without going through him. Even if she left the next day, that choice would be hers, but tonight, she was safe. And in a place like Willow Run, where the wind always carried more dust than comfort, that was saying something. Would you have opened the door, or stood on that porch, watching, wondering what happens when someone has nothing left to trade but themselves? Mason didn't need to know everything. He just needed to know this: she needed help. And help, real help, doesn't always come with conditions. Sometimes it just opens the door.
Leela watched him, eyes flicking from his hands to his face, still waiting for the catch, maybe, still expecting the moment where kindness turns into cost. But it didn't come. Mason handed her the food. She didn't eat, not yet. She broke the bread in half, handed a piece to her son, and held the cup steady as he drank. And then, only then, she let herself breathe. That moment, it wasn't loud, wasn't cinematic in the Hollywood sense, but it was powerful. The kind of moment where your chest tightens just a little and something ancient in you softens, whether you want it to or not. I remember once, years ago, I saw a woman on a Greyhound bus cradle her child with the same quiet desperation. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just held him close, kept brushing his hair back like the touch alone might protect him from the world. And I thought then, as I think now, there's nothing stronger than a mother who's already lost everything, except the one thing she refuses to give up. Leela was that kind of strong. After the boy finished, Mason nodded toward the cot. She didn't ask if it was okay, just moved, gentle but certain, laid him down, tucked the blanket around him. Then she sat on the floor beside him, back against the wall, knees drawn to her chest like she still couldn't trust the safety around her. Mason didn't interrupt. He cleaned the pan, sat at his desk, picked up a pen, and pretended to review a report that didn't matter. Somehow, that quiet filled the room more than words ever could. And maybe that's the point. We live in a world now where everything's loud. Opinions, judgments, expectations, all screaming over each other. But back then, in that room, all it took was silence, and one man's decision not to ask for anything in return. You might be wondering, what made Mason Dyer do it? Why not turn her away like so many others might have? Maybe he saw something of himself in that boy. Maybe he remembered someone he couldn't save. Or maybe, just maybe, he didn't need a reason. Kindness doesn't always come from a place of logic. Sometimes it just shows up, like shade in the desert, like a door opening when you least expect it. That night, Mason let them stay. He didn't ask her story, didn't demand a name. He just made sure the boy had a place to sleep, and the woman, Leela, had a moment to exhale. In a town like Willow Run, where the wind carries more judgment than mercy, that was no small thing. And in a life where so much depends on timing, one wrong turn, one missed chance, maybe this meeting wasn't fate. Maybe it was just one man doing the right thing. But sometimes, that's enough to change everything.
They say the West is built on silence, on the things left unsaid between long stretches of dry wind and long miles of dust. But sometimes, that silence gets shattered in a way you don't forget. It was late afternoon, the kind where the light burns orange against the saloon windows, and even the shadows seemed tired. Sheriff Mason Dyer stood on the porch of his office, chewing a piece of jerky without much interest. He'd seen dust storms roll in, drifters roll through, and more than a few souls looking to bury something or someone in the wide, dry lands around Willow Run. But nothing quite prepared him for what that woman said. She was young, or had been once, but her face carried the weight of someone who'd lived too hard, too long. Leela. He didn't know her name yet, but he'd remember her eyes. Hollow, cracked around the edges, but still steady. And her voice, it was dry as sand, raw from wind and walking. No tears, no begging. She just said, "Take me as your concubine. I can do whatever you want, just feed my boy." And then she waited, like someone used to hear and know. Mason didn't speak, not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around someone so desperate they're willing to offer themselves up like currency, but it's not something you shake off. It sits in your chest, heavy, uncomfortable, unfair. Some folks might have judged her right then and there. Some might have looked away, or worse, accepted the offer. But Mason was built different. He looked at her for a moment longer, then pushed open the office door and stepped aside. It wasn't a gesture of charity, not pity. It was something quieter, something harder to name, like respect or recognition, the kind of thing you don't find in law books, but sometimes shows up in the hands of the right people. She hesitated, just for a breath, maybe thinking it was a trick, maybe bracing herself for more pain. But then she walked in, slow, steady, still holding her boy like he was the only thing she had left worth saving. And Mason, still without a word, went to the shelf, grabbed a tin of beans and started heating it on the stove, found some leftover bread, poured milk into a cracked cup. He didn't rush, didn't act like a savior. He just moved with the same steady rhythm he always had. Like this, feeding the hungry was just another part of the day. Sometimes I think the real test of a person isn't how they act when they're needed, but how they act when no one's watching. When there's no praise, no audience, just a decision. Yes or no. Help or don't.
There's a certain kind of quiet that settles over small towns after the sun goes down. It's not silence exactly, more like the absence of urgency. The wind softens, boots stop echoing on wooden walkways, even the stars seem to breathe slower. That was the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around the town of Willow Run the night Mason let Layla and her son stay. The cot in the back of the sheriff's office creaked only once as she laid the boy down. He was out within minutes, still clutching the piece of bread he hadn't finished, like he didn't quite trust it would still be there in the morning. Layla didn't sleep. Not yet. She sat in the corner beside the bed, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes open, staring at nothing. And Mason? He didn't say a word. He didn't ask who she was running from, didn't ask why she looked like someone who'd crawled through hell and come out the other side too tired to explain it. He didn't offer platitudes or promises. He just poured her a cup of water, left it on the windowsill, and let the quiet do what words couldn't. I think there's something sacred about that kind of stillness, when someone gives you space without making you feel like a burden. No questions, no demands, just presence. Somewhere in the early hours, Mason dozed off in the chair behind his desk, hat tilted over his face. And for the first time in what might have been days, Layla closed her eyes too. The next morning came soft, light through dusty glass, a rooster crowing from somewhere behind the saloon, the slow clatter of a wagon wheel in the distance. It was just another morning in Willow Run. And yet, something had shifted. She woke early, earlier than Mason, in fact, found a basin in the corner and washed her face with trembling hands, took a deep breath, then another. You could tell she hadn't had the chance to do that in a while, just breathe without fear. And here's where something beautiful happened. She didn't sneak away, didn't pretend it hadn't happened. She stayed. She noticed the cluttered desk, the stack of unwashed tin cups in the corner, the dusty windows, and without a word, she started cleaning. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't transactional. It was instinct, the kind that comes from someone who's lived in places where the only thing you could give in return was effort. Mason woke to the sound of clinking metal, sat up slow, adjusted his hat, and watched her for a moment. She didn't look back, just kept going, wiping down surfaces, folding the worn blanket neatly, straightening the boy's shirt collar when he stirred. That morning passed like that. No conversation, just motion, a rhythm forming between them. And that's the thing about trust. It doesn't arrive all at once. It's not declared or demanded. It shows up in the little things, in the way someone boils water without being asked, in the way someone else lets them. Over the next few days, she stayed, not because Mason told her to, and not because she asked, but because there was nowhere else to go. And because for the first time in a long time, there was no pressure to explain why. She swept the floors, took the boy out to sit in the sun, helped the old widow across the street carry her groceries one morning. And slowly, the folks around town started noticing not just her presence, but her effort. They didn't smile yet, didn't wave, but they stopped staring quite so hard. That's how change happens in towns like this. Quiet, reluctant, but steady. And Mason, he didn't try to fix her. He didn't lean into whatever story was behind her eyes. He just made space, offered food when she was too tired to ask, fixed the broken latch on the door when it started to stick, sat on the porch with her boy one afternoon while she napped inside for the first time in what felt like years. He still didn't speak much, but his actions did. And I think that's what made it all so powerful. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments of revelation, Just a woman, a child, and a man. 3 people finding a rhythm in the quiet space left behind by pain. I've heard people say that healing has to be loud, that you have to talk about it, dig it up, name every wound. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes healing is just rest. It's not having to explain yourself for once. It's being allowed to scrub a floor, fold a blanket, and slowly let your guard down without anyone demanding you justify your right to be there. I remember once, after a long season of loss in my own life, someone invited me to dinner. They didn't ask me to talk, didn't tell me to open up. They just served food, gave me a chair, laughed at something ordinary. And for the first time in weeks, I remembered what it felt like to be human. Not broken, not healing, just present. That's what Mason gave Layla. And that's what she gave back. Not through words, but through consistency, through showing up, through doing what needed to be done without anyone asking her to do it. Trust, in that dusty little town, began not with a handshake or a conversation, but with a cup of water, a folded blanket, and a shared silence that felt more like home than any building ever had. And maybe that's all some folks ever need. Not to be saved, just to be seen and allowed to stay.
In a town like Willow Run, people don't need much to start talking. A stranger passes through? That's news. A stranger stays? That's a storm. And when that stranger is a woman with a bruised past and a child on her hip, well, let's just say the dust doesn't settle easy. It started slow. A sideways glance at the general store, a murmured comment in the church pew. Nothing direct, just whispers, the kind that cling to walls and hang in the air long after you've left the room. You know the kind I mean. It's not what they say to your face, it's what they say after you walk away that cuts deeper. Leela had been in town barely a week, but folks already had theories. She was a runaway. A troublemaker, a woman of low virtue, someone said. The kind of talk that wraps itself in polite language but is meant to wound. Mason heard it. Of course he did. He wasn't deaf, and he wasn't dumb. But if it bothered him, he didn't show it. He just kept doing what he always did. Woke early, did his rounds, kept the peace. Only difference now was that 2 extra cups sat on his desk in the mornings, one smaller than the other. And sometimes he came back from the bakery with 3 rolls instead of 1. That didn't go unnoticed. You see, in small towns, kindness can make people uncomfortable. It breaks their rhythm, makes them question their own stillness. And when a man like Mason Dyer, known for his stoic silence and sharp sense of right and wrong, starts opening his door to someone no one else will, people start to wonder why. Why her? What did she do to earn that kind of protection? And maybe that's the problem. We live in a world that wants suffering to be justified. People want a backstory before they offer compassion. They want to know, did you deserve this pain? Have you suffered enough to earn my sympathy? But Mason didn't ask any of that. He just saw a woman who needed help, and he gave it. End of story. Still, the town didn't let up. One afternoon, outside the barber shop, a few men stood talking low, their eyes tracking Mason as he walked past with Leela's boy perched on his hip. One of them spit in the dirt and muttered something about how decent men don't play house with strangers. Mason stopped, turned, and looked that man dead in the eye. He didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for his badge or his gun, just stared long enough that the man looked down at his boots and shuffled back inside. That was Mason's way, quiet but firm. He didn't argue with cowards. He just made it real clear whose side he was on. And Leela? She didn't say much either. She didn't fight the whispers or try to win anyone over. She just kept showing up, helping where she could, letting her actions speak for her. She scrubbed floors at the church, carried baskets for the older women who never quite met her eyes. She stood in the back during Sunday service, not because she wasn't welcome to sit, but because she understood space and how to earn it. You ever feel like you have to prove you belong in a place that's already decided you don't? It's exhausting, but Leela carried it well. She didn't flinch when the whispers grew louder, and when someone muttered the word whore a little too close to the sheriff's office, Mason stepped out, leaned against the doorframe, and said, "Say it again, louder." They didn't. In fact, that was the last time that word was spoken in public. It didn't stop the gossip, but it sent a message. And through all this, through every silent breakfast, every glance passed across the room, every evening spent rocking the boy to sleep while the sky turned pink, something was building between Mason and Leela. Not in the way people expected, not with passion or urgency or whispered confessions, but in the quiet things. The way he always poured her coffee before his own, the way she folded his shirt when it slipped off the chair, the way he'd touch her elbow when she walked past, just lightly, like saying, "I see you," without saying anything at all. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was understanding, a kind of shared loneliness that found its match. And maybe that's the rarest kind of connection there is, the kind where nothing needs to be spoken because both people are carrying something too tender for words. I remember once, during a long winter in my own life, sitting beside someone on a bench at a bus stop. We didn't speak, not even look at each other. But I remember thinking, they get it. That quiet kind of grief, that ache of being somewhere but not feeling seen. That's what was happening between Mason and Leela. Not a love story, not yet, but a trust story. And sometimes that's more powerful. Because in a town full of noise and suspicion, the quiet between them felt like truth. They didn't owe anyone answers, and they sure as hell didn't need permission to care. Let the town whisper. Let them wonder. Some things are worth defending, even when no one understands why. And Mason Dyer, he had already decided. Leela and her boy were under his roof and under his protection. And for the first time in a long time, maybe in her whole life, that protection felt like peace.
There's something about a man's past that has a way of finding him. No matter how far he runs, how long he stays quiet, or how hard he tries to rebuild. And for Layla, it showed up one morning, on horseback. The air was dry that day, the kind that cracks your lips just by breathing. The wind carried the scent of mesquite and horse sweat, and from the porch of the sheriff's office, Mason could already feel it in his bones. Something was coming. 3 riders appeared at the far end of Main Street, the kind of men who didn't blend in, dust on their coats, guns on their hips, and a way of scanning every window like they were searching for something they didn't intend to leave without. And they were. They weren't outlaws, not exactly. Not the kind who robbed banks or shot their way into legend. No, these were different. Hired men, paid muscle. The sort of wolves sent ahead to sniff out weakness before the pack moves in. And their orders? Simple. Find the woman, bring her back to Vernon Rudd. Now, Vernon wasn't a name that carried much weight in Willow Run, but Mason knew the type. A man who thinks ownership and love are the same thing. A man who loses control and, instead of letting go, sends men to fetch what he believes still belongs to him. They stopped in front of the office, boots hitting the dirt, heavy with purpose. One of them stepped forward, tall, narrow eyes, calloused hands, the kind of man who'd broken more than a few ribs in the dark without blinking twice. "You the sheriff?" he asked. Mason stood slow and measured,
brushing crumbs off his lap. "I am. We're looking for someone. A lot of folks pass through here. This one didn't pass through. She's hiding. Brown hair, worn dress, little boy in tow. Belongs to a man named Vernon Rudd." And there it was. That word. Belongs. I don't know how many times I've heard that word used wrong. About women, about children even, about land even. But that morning, when Mason heard it, something shifted in his jaw. Just slightly. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said. The man raised an eyebrow, lips twitching like he might laugh. "We ain't here to argue law, just here to bring her home. She's already home." Behind Mason, Layla was inside, frozen by the door, her hand hovering just above the latch. She'd heard the voices. She knew the tone. She'd heard it 100 times before, the sound of men pretending what they're doing is justified. But this time, she wasn't alone. Mason didn't step back. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flash his badge or his gun. He just stood his ground the way men do when they've made peace with the weight of their own name. "You can ride back to Vernon Rudd, tell him she's safe, tell him the boy's well, and tell him if he wants to come make a claim on another human being, he'll have to come himself, and he better be ready for what comes with that." There was a pause. A long one. You ever been in a moment where everything tightens, your shoulders, your gut, the air itself, and all it would take is one twitch of a finger for things to go sideways? This was that moment. But the men didn't twitch. One of them glanced to the left toward the saloon, saw the curtains shift. Another one looked at the schoolhouse, heard kids laughing in the distance. And the third, the one who'd done all the talking, looked Mason in the eye just long enough to realize this wasn't the kind of man who bluffed. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Then he mounted his horse, spit in the dirt, and turned his back. And that was that. They rode off in silence, their dust rising behind them like smoke after a fire's been put out. Mason stood there for a while, long after the hooves had faded, long after the last trace of their presence disappeared into the horizon. He didn't look back right away. He didn't have to. Inside, Layla exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. Her legs gave out a little, and she slid to the floor, the boy crawling into her lap like he knew she needed to hold something to remind her this was real, that she was safe. And Mason? He finally stepped back inside, took off his hat, and hung it on the peg. Still no words. None were needed. Because sometimes protection doesn't come in the form of walls or promises. Sometimes it's just a man standing between you and the past and refusing to move.
There comes a point, somewhere between survival and surrender, where a person finally chooses to speak their truth, not because it's safe, not because the fear is gone, but because staying silent hurts more than telling it. For Layla, that moment came not in a storm, not in the heat of danger, but on a quiet morning while washing a tin plate beneath the pump behind the sheriff's office. The wind was soft that day, the kind that brushes your skin instead of peeling it, the kind that makes you think, for just a second, maybe things can grow here. She didn't plan to tell him. Most people don't plan moments like that. They just rise up, like steam from warm ground. "I was 16 when I married him," she said, still looking down at the water, hands scrubbing slow. "Didn't know much, just that my father wanted me out of the house, and Vernon wanted something to own." Mason didn't respond. He was sitting on the steps, whittling a piece of wood, not shaping it into anything in particular, just keeping his hands busy while she spoke. You learn quick what a man's capable of when he sees you as his property. Every kindness costs you something, and every silence buys you one more day without a bruise. She paused, not to see if he was listening. She already knew he was, but just to take a breath. That kind of breath you don't realize you've been holding since you were a teenager. I stayed until I couldn't anymore. He hit my boy. Not hard, not like he hit me, but enough that I knew if we didn't leave then, I'd never forgive myself. The pump creaked as she shut it off, water still dripping from her hands. I thought we'd die out there. I figured dying in the dust was better than dying in that house. She looked at him then. And maybe it still is, but at least now I know what it feels like to be safe. He set the piece of wood down beside him. I don't want your protection, she said, her voice low but steady. Not if it comes with a price. I've paid too much already. Mason nodded. Not slow, not hesitant, just certain. You're not mine to protect, he said, but you're welcome to stay, for as long as you want. There wasn't a romantic swell to that moment. No music, no embrace, just honesty. And strangely enough, that made it more powerful. You see, a lot of stories will tell you that love is about rescue, about heroes on horseback or big declarations at sunset. But I don't buy that. Real love, real connection, it's quieter than that. It looks more like freedom than fireworks. And that's what Mason gave her. Not a new life, not a promise of happily ever after. He gave her the right to choose, to stay because she wanted to, not because she needed to be a mother, not a prisoner, to wake up each day and know that the man across from her saw her as whole, not broken. That choice, so small in the grand scheme of things, was everything. In the weeks that followed, their lives began to braid together in the simplest of ways. He taught his boy how to whittle. She taught Mason how to bake biscuits without turning them into bricks. They shared quiet mornings and longer evenings and sometimes even laughter. Gentle, unpracticed, but real. There were no labels, no vows, just two people who'd each survived something and now, somehow, were learning how to live again. And I think that's what made it work. Because sometimes a family isn't made by blood or by law. It's made by choice, by presence, by the simple act of staying when you could have left. They didn't need to say it out loud. The way she poured his coffee without asking, the way he checked the locks twice at night just in case, the way the boy reached for Mason's hand now when crossing the street. It was all there, unspoken, but solid. And maybe you felt something like that. Maybe not the same shape, not the same story, but that slow, quiet unfolding of trust after a long season of fear. Maybe you've learned, like they did, that love doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it just shows up with warm food, with an open door, with the words, "You're not mine, but you can stay." And that's more than enough to build something real, even in a town like Willow Run, even in the dust.
Some mornings come quieter than others. Not because the world is any less noisy, but because something inside you has finally gone still. And that's what it felt like in Willow Run, not long after the dust had settled. Not the storm kind, but the kind that stirs in a person's soul. It didn't happen all at once. Change never does. But slowly, like desert rain seeping into dry ground, life began to reshape itself. Layla still woke early. That part hadn't changed. She'd always be the kind of woman who checked the locks twice and looked over her shoulder without even thinking. But her eyes, they softened. Her shoulders stopped sitting so high. And her hands, well, they started doing things for the joy of it, not just out of survival. She cooked more, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The scent of biscuits and sage sometimes drifted out of the sheriff's office kitchen and onto the boardwalk, and passers-by would pause, just for a moment, to wonder how something that warm could come from a place that had been so quiet for so long. Folks started waving to her more, saying her name, not in whispers, but in greeting. One of the store clerks even gave her boy a peppermint one day, unasked.
You could feel it, a kind of thaw. Even in a place as set in its ways as Willow Run, kindness was starting to crack through. But maybe the biggest change wasn't in the town. Maybe it was in Tommy. That boy, the same one who barely spoke a word when he first arrived, had found his laugh again. And Lord, when a child laughs like that, you realize how wrong it is for it to have ever gone missing in the first place. He'd run down the path behind the sheriff's office, chasing a stray dog, with shoelaces flapping, hair wild, cheeks pink from the sun. And he started school. Now, the first day he walked in, clutching a book too tightly and looking up at the other boys like they might bite, that was hard, real hard. But then one of the girls, Emily Harper, scooted her chair just enough to make room at the table. Didn't say a word, just smiled and went back to her spelling. And in that small, quiet act, Tommy found a way in. Before long, he was reciting poems with the others, trading marbles at recess, bringing home papers with stars drawn in red pencil and a crooked little grin that said more than 1,000 words ever could. And I remember watching Mason the first time he picked Tommy up from school. He didn't say much, Mason never did, but the way he looked at that boy, like he was memorizing the shape of his steps, that said it all. You know, it's a strange thing watching someone relearn trust. It doesn't happen in one big moment. It's in the little ones, like when Layla let someone else braid her hair at church, or when she left the sheriff's office door unlocked just once because she forgot she was afraid, or when Tommy scraped his knee and ran to Mason without thinking, not for safety, but for comfort. And maybe that's the difference between surviving and living. Survival is flinching at every sound. Living is knowing you don't have to anymore. I remember a woman I knew back in Abilene. She'd come out of something rough. You could see it in the way she held herself, like every word was a test. But then she started volunteering at the library, reading stories to children. And one day, she read one with her whole heart. Silly voices, big gestures, the whole thing. And when she looked up and saw the kids laughing, she cried. Because that was the moment she realized she wasn't broken anymore. And maybe that's what was happening to Layla than Tommy. Not a perfect ending, not a fairy tale, but something more precious. Peace. It didn't mean the past was gone. It didn't mean Vernon Rudd was erased from memory or that fear never crept in. But now that fear had company. It had context. It had love standing beside it, holding the line. The sheriff's office began to feel more like a home than a holding cell. The people who once whispered now asked Layla for recipes. And Tommy? He just got to be a boy. A whole boy. Not a shadow. And Mason? Well, he stayed the same in most ways. Still quiet, still steady, still a man of few words and firm principles. But now his silences carried warmth. His days had meaning beyond law and order. His table had 3 plates. And sometimes, just sometimes, he smiled before his coffee. So if you ever wonder whether healing is real, whether someone who's been through hell can truly start over, I'll tell you this. It doesn't come with trumpets. It comes with biscuits on a cool morning, with a child's laughter ringing down a dusty road, with a man who doesn't ask for thanks and a woman who no longer flinches when someone reaches for her hand. That's not a fantasy. That's just a life rebuilt. And in the quiet town of Willow Run, under skies wide enough to hold all their past and all their hope, that was more than enough.
Sometimes the past doesn't knock. Sometimes it rides in, heavy and loud, dragging everything behind it like a rusted chain. It was late afternoon when Vernon Rudd showed up in Willow Run. The sky was swollen with dust again, not the kind that comes from weather, but the kind that rises behind hooves when something mean and deliberate is heading straight for you. Layla saw it first. She was sweeping the step outside the sheriff's office when she spotted them. 5 riders, dressed in black coats, too heavy for the heat. Men who didn't look around, didn't wave, didn't belong. And at the center of them all, Vernon. She froze. Not like someone scared, but like someone remembering. Her grip tightened on the broom handle. She didn't run inside, didn't call for Mason. She just stood there, still, watching. And inside, Mason had already stood from his desk, as if he felt it coming before it came. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a man like Vernon before, but I can tell you what they look like. Arrogant, like the world owes them something and they're here to collect. Cruel, the kind of cruel that doesn't need fists anymore because words cut just as deep. And confident, not because they're strong, but because they've gotten away with too much for too long. Vernon dismounted like he owned the land beneath his boots, walked toward the sheriff's door like he'd just come to pick up a package. No urgency, no shame. "I've come for what's mine," he said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Mason met him at the threshold, calm, unshaken. "You'll need to be more specific, because nothing here belongs to you." Vernon smirked, that smug, oily kind of smirk that makes your skin crawl. "Don't play dumb, Sheriff. The woman, the boy, you know damn well they're mine." Mason didn't blink, didn't move. They were never yours. Behind Mason, Layla stepped out, slow, measured, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not property, Vernon. Not anymore." Now, there's something about hearing your own voice say what you've always been afraid to admit. It's like striking a match inside your own ribs. Something catches fire, and you realize you're not the same woman he left behind. Vernon took a step forward. That's when Mason lifted his rifle. Didn't point it, just raised it enough to make a statement. "I won't tell you again. You leave now or you leave bleeding. Your call." One of Vernon's men shifted in the saddle, hand twitching near his holster. Mason didn't flinch. Then, bang! A single shot rang out. The bullet hit the dirt 2 feet in front of Vernon's boots, close enough to send dust flying onto his coat, close enough to make the horse behind him rear. But it wasn't a warning, not really. It was a line. And Vernon finally understood he wasn't in control anymore. He looked at Layla. Really looked at her. Like he was trying to recognize something he'd once broken. And for the first time in his miserable, control-hungry life, she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She stood taller, next to Mason, behind her son. And I imagine in that moment, Vernon realized the thing he'd feared most wasn't losing her. It was losing his grip on someone who no longer needed to be afraid of him. He turned without a word, mounted his horse, gave a short nod, and they left. Just like that. No gunfight, no threats. Because sometimes the most powerful moment isn't the shot that's fired, it's the silence that follows when the tyrant finally knows he's lost. After they disappeared over the ridge, Mason lowered his rifle. Layla exhaled. And Tommy? He ran straight into her arms, burying his face into her side. Mason didn't say anything. He just stepped closer and placed a hand gently on her back, not as a protector, but as a partner. And Layla, she let him. Now, maybe you've never had to face down a monster from your past in broad daylight. Maybe your battles have looked different. But I bet you know what it feels like to wish someone would stand with you. Really stand. Not to speak for you, not to fix you. Just to say, you're not alone. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't. Someone stood. Someone stayed. Someone chose her. Not because they had to, but because she was worth it. And
That is how you know you've come home. She looked at Mason, the quiet around them heavier than ever, but softer too. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, she whispered. Mason met her gaze, steady and calm. Then we'll find out together, he said.
Some endings don't need fireworks. They don't come wrapped in confessions or vows or grand declarations. Sometimes the most powerful ending is the quiet one, the kind that slips in at dusk, gentle and steady, like a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding for years. That's how it was for Layla, Mason, and the boy. That final night didn't look like much to anyone else. The sun had dipped behind the hills, the wind had finally gone still. Inside the sheriff's office, now more home than workplace, Tommy was curled up on the cot, his legs tangled in a too-big blanket, his chest rising and falling with the kind of peace only children and the healed seem to find. There were no more bags packed by the door, no horses waiting to ride out before dawn, no fear tapping on the window. Just quiet. Mason stood by the window, hat in hand. Layla sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, even though she hadn't taken a sip in over 10 minutes. Neither of them spoke. But it wasn't the kind of silence that begs to be broken. It was full. It was complete. She looked over at him, this man who had never promised her anything, yet had given her everything that mattered. He hadn't asked her to stay. She hadn't asked him if she could, and that somehow made it real. I think we've all been taught to look for the big moments, the proposals, the celebrations, the declarations in the rain. But real life, it's not always like that, is it? Sometimes the most honest kind of love doesn't say, "I'll love you forever." It just stays. It pours you coffee in the morning. It fixes the squeaky hinge without being asked. It takes the late shift when the kid's got a fever. It puts a hand on your back, not to push or to hold you back, but just to let you know you're not alone. That's what this was. They didn't speak the words. There were no I do's, no plans drawn out for the next 10 years. Only presence, only peace. Only two people who had made it through hell and found each other on the other side. Not to save one another, but to walk beside each other. And for Tommy, he didn't ask questions. Kids don't need labels when the love is real. He just started calling Mason Sheriff less and Mace more. And then one day, without thinking, Pa. That was enough. I remember a night years ago, sitting in a small house in Montana with a woman who'd lost everything, her husband, her home, her voice, almost. And when I asked her what saved her, she didn't say therapy or faith or time. She said someone stayed. That was it. Someone stayed. And when I think about Layla and Mason, I think about that too. They didn't fix each other. They didn't fill in every crack, but they stayed. And sometimes that's more than enough to build a whole new beginning. So no, there wasn't a wedding, no rings exchanged beneath a chapel roof, but that night, as Mason sat beside her and gently reached across the table to take her hand, rough, calloused fingers curling around hers, something unspoken passed between them. A choice, not born out of desperation, but out of love. They would keep going. Together. Come dust or storm or whatever life had left to throw at them. And in the soft glow of the oil lamp, with the boy safe in bed and no more fear at the door, a family was quietly formed. No last name shared, no legal ties, just hearts that had been broken, slowly beating again, in rhythm. That's the thing about second chances. They don't always look like redemption. Sometimes they just look like rest, like warmth, like a home you didn't know you were allowed to want. And maybe that's all any of us are looking for in the end. Not a perfect love, just a place where we're no longer running, a place to stay, a hand to hold in the dark, and the courage to begin again.